I told my son I was broke and needed to sell the house. He said, "Finally, I've been waiting for this." I wasn't broke. I was testing him. The next morning, I overheard him on the phone telling someone the price he already had in mind. What he said next left me unable to speak. I'd noticed things for months before any of this started, small enough on their own that I kept explaining them away instead of adding them together. Questions about the house that were a little too specific for someone who was supposedly just checking in on his father. A comment about how much square footage I didn't need anymore now that I lived alone dropped into a conversation about something else entirely, as if it had just occurred to him in passing. A remark about how the neighborhood had come up in value over the last decade, the kind of thing you'd only know if you'd actually looked it up rather than absorbed it casually. There was a conversation about the business sale too, months earlier, an offhand question about whether the proceeds had come in as a lump sum or as an installment arrangement spread over years. I remember answering it without thinking much of it at the time, the way you answer a question from your own son without running it through a filter first. It was only later, turning the conversation back over, that I noticed how precisely it had been aimed, how it wasn't the kind of question people ask out of general interest in their father's well-being. It was the kind of question people ask when they're trying to model something. I want to be fair about this. Fathers notice things about their children that could mean nothing at all. A single comment about a house being too big is just a comment. A single question about finances is just a question. I've spent a long career not mistaking noise for signal, and I didn't want to become a man who saw a plot in every offhand remark his son made at a holiday dinner, so I sat with it. I let individual moments pass without reacting to them, filed them away instead, and watched to see whether they kept arriving or whether I'd imagined a pattern where there wasn't one. They kept arriving. Not constantly, not in a way obvious to anyone watching from outside, but often enough and specific enough that by late summer I had stopped being able to tell myself it was nothing. I don't think my son realized how much he was showing me in those small, low-stakes moments, the ones where a person's guard is down because the stakes feel too low to bother raising it. That's usually where the truth lives, not in the big declarations people rehearse, but in the sentence they didn't think mattered enough to plan. So I built a test. I want to be precise about what that means, because it's easy to hear that phrase and imagine something more elaborate than what I actually did. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't set traps around the house. I sat down with the accountant who has handled my books for a long time, a careful man who has never once asked me a question he didn't need the answer to, and I asked him to help me put together a version of my finances that told a different story than the real one. The story I wanted was simple enough to be believable and specific enough to survive a follow-up question. A story with no detail behind it falls apart the moment someone asks a second question, and my son is not a man who accepts a first answer without probing it. So we built it properly. A business sale that had cleared debts and left little else, structured plausibly enough that anyone who understood these transactions wouldn't find it strange. A savings account drawn down over a couple of difficult years to something under $30,000. A number thin enough that selling a house worth the better part of $1 million would read as necessary rather than optional. I spent an evening going over those fictional numbers by myself, running through the version of the conversation where someone asked me a hard question about them, making sure I had an answer ready that wouldn't contradict itself. I have built real financial pictures under real pressure more times than I can count, and there's a discipline to it that doesn't go away just because the exercise is fictional. You have to know the numbers the way you know something true. I also had to decide how to say it, not just what to say. Too much drama and he might smell a performance. Too little and he might not take it seriously enough to react honestly. I wanted the moment to feel exactly like what it would feel like if it were real. A quiet admission over coffee rather than a speech, because the whole value of the test depended on him believing it completely, without hedging, without wondering if I was testing him for even a second. If he suspected anything, the test would tell me nothing. It had to be real to him for the results to mean anything to me. I settled on a Sunday. He and I have had a standing rhythm of Sunday dinners for years, just the two of us most weeks since his mother passed, a rhythm neither of us has ever needed to schedule out loud because it simply happens. That familiarity was useful. It meant I could deliver this inside a setting so ordinary that its ordinariness would work in my favor. A comfortable, low-guard moment where a person is more likely to react honestly because nothing about the setting suggests they should be careful. I called him on a Friday and asked if he could come by Sunday evening. He said of course, the way he always says of course, and I spent the 2 days in between going over the numbers one more time until I could recite them without hesitation. The way you rehearse something you need to say once and say correctly. He arrived on time Sunday, which he generally does, and we sat down to the kind of dinner we've had 100 times. Unremarkable in every way that mattered until the moment it wasn't. We talked about his week, a project he was managing that was running behind schedule, a minor complaint about a colleague who wasn't pulling his share of the work, ordinary things. I let the meal run its normal course, cleared the plates the way I always do, and made coffee, because coffee is when the real conversations in this house have always happened, going back to when he was young enough that the real conversations were about homework and curfews rather than houses and money. I told him over coffee. I didn't build up to it with a long preamble, because a long preamble would have signaled that something unusual was coming coming, and I wanted the delivery to feel as plain and settled as the fictional facts themselves were supposed to be. I said the business hadn't recovered the way I'd hoped after the sale, that the savings had thinned out faster than I expected over the last couple of years, that I'd looked at the numbers honestly and didn't see another way around it. I told him I was going to have to sell the house I'd lived in for 30 years. I watched his face while I said it. I want to describe that carefully, because the half second immediately after those words left my mouth is the part of this entire evening I have gone back over more times than anything else that followed. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes over a person's face right before they respond to something they weren't prepared for, a gap where the mind hasn't yet decided what expression to wear, and I saw that gap open up in him. And then he said one word before he could stop it, finally, followed immediately by 4 more, spoken with a plainness that told me they were unrehearsed, arriving straight from wherever the truth in him lives before it gets edited. I've been waiting for this. I did not react visibly. I want to be honest that this took effort. Every part of me wanted to set the coffee down and ask him directly what he meant by that, but I understood immediately that the value of what I'd just heard depended entirely on not interrupting whatever came next, on letting him have the space to either compound the mistake or begin covering it, because either one would tell me something true. He began covering it almost immediately. I watched the recalculation happen behind his eyes, the specific look of a man realizing a word has already left his mouth and cannot be called back, only managed. He said he'd misspoken, that he only meant he was relieved the truth was finally out in the open, that he'd sensed something wasn't right with my finances and had been waiting for me to be honest about it. He said he wanted to help. He said we'd figure this out together, as a family. He talked for several minutes in that careful, over-explained register people use when they're walking a sentence back to somewhere safer than where it landed. I let him talk. I nodded at the appropriate places. I thanked him for offering to help, and I meant the thanks narrowly, grateful for the information even as I understood I couldn't yet trust the sentiment behind it. The rest of the evening proceeded the way a difficult family conversation does once the initial shock passes and everyone settles into managing it. He asked practical questions. Had I gotten an appraisal? Did I have a sense of the house's current market value? Was I planning to use a realtor? I answered each with the same careful vagueness I'd rehearsed. A man who hadn't worked out the details yet because he'd only just made peace with the decision itself. It was late by the time we finished, later than either of us had planned, and he mentioned he didn't love the idea of driving the 20 minutes back at that hour. I said the guest room was made up, the way it always is, and he took me up on it without hesitation, in the easy, familiar way of a man who has stayed in that room dozens of times before and thinks nothing of doing it again. I lay awake longer than I normally do that night. Not from anxiety exactly, more from the specific alertness that comes after you've learned something you weren't sure you wanted to know, turning the evening over from different angles, trying to decide how much weight to put on a single word spoken in an unguarded half-second. I told myself I would know more by morning. I didn't yet understand how much more. I am an early riser, 30 years of habit built into a body that no longer knows how to sleep past 5, from decades running a business where the first crews went out before 6. Retirement changes a great many things. It never touched that particular clock in me. I was in the kitchen with coffee well before sunrise, standing at the counter in the gray early light. That's when I heard the side door open, quietly, the way a person opens a door when they don't want to wake someone else in the house, followed by the soft sound of footsteps moving along the flagstone path that runs alongside the kitchen wall. I assumed at first he was simply stepping out for air, or checking his phone somewhere he thought was private, the ordinary business of a houseguest finding a quiet corner of the yard before the rest of the household is awake. He clearly believed he had found that privacy. What he didn't account for, or didn't remember, is that the flagstone path runs directly beneath the kitchen window, and that I have lived in this house long enough to know precisely how sound travels along that particular stretch of wall on a still morning, how a voice pitched low outside can carry with startling clarity if the air isn't moving and the window is cracked even slightly, which it was because I like the morning air while I have my coffee. I heard him dial. I heard the small electronic tones of a phone number being entered, followed by a pause, and then his voice, low but entirely audible, in the clipped, business-like register he uses with people he isn't bothering to charm, people he considers colleagues rather than family. "Good morning," he said in that voice, and I stood at my own counter with my coffee cooling in my hand and listened to my son discuss my house and my finances with someone I couldn't identify on my own property at 6 in the morning, believing entirely that no one could hear a word of it. He laid out numbers the way a man lays out numbers when he's said them enough times in his own head that they've stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like a fact. The house would move for $900,000 easily in the current market, he said. Maybe more if it was presented properly, staged and listed with the right agent at the right time of year. I recognized the figure immediately as roughly accurate. I'd had a rough sense of the house's value from casual conversations with neighbors who had sold in the last few years, and 900 was, if anything, a conservative estimate rather than an inflated one. But if he got in first, he said, ahead of any realtor I might think to call on my own, with a friendly offer framed as a fair deal from a family contact, someone in real estate who knew the neighborhood and wanted to help an older homeowner avoid the hassle of a full listing, I'd probably take $750,000 and never know the difference. He said it exactly like that. Never know the difference. As though the entire value of the plan rested on a specific and calculated read of me, a man who hadn't sold a house in 30 years and wouldn't think to independently verify what he was being told it was worth. I want to describe what that did to me standing there because I think it's the part of this story people understand least on the first pass. It wasn't primarily about the money, though a spread of $150,000 is not a small thing by any measure, and I'd be lying if I said the number itself didn't land somewhere in me. What actually stopped my breath was the architecture underneath the number. This wasn't a man improvising in a moment of temptation. This was a man who had already worked out the appraisal range, already identified the exact lever he intended to pull. My own trust and my own unfamiliarity with a market I hadn't touched in decades, and had clearly rehearsed the pitch enough times that it came out of him smooth and unhesitating at 6 a.m. on a flagstone path. I stood at the counter and did not move. I remember consciously deciding not to move, worried that even the small sound of a mug being set down might carry as clearly back through that window as his voice had carried in. I wanted to hear the rest of it. I needed to hear the rest of it, because some part of me was still hoping, even then, that what I'd find at the bottom of this was something survivable, an isolated moment of poor judgment rather than a fully built structure. I did not get the version I was hoping for. His voice dropped lower on the next part, and even through the window I could hear the shift in register, the sound of a man moving from the part of a conversation he's comfortable having openly to the part he'd rather not have overheard, which meant it was the part I needed to hear most. "Don't worry about my brother finding out," he said. "I've already got a plan in place for handling that conversation too. Dad won't see any of it coming until it's already done." I want to sit with that sentence a moment longer than I sat with it in the actual instant, because standing at the counter I processed it almost too fast to feel the full shape of it, the way you sometimes absorb a serious injury before the pain has caught up to the fact of it. What he was describing wasn't a single lapse in judgment about a house. It was a structure with two separate tracks running simultaneously, one narrative calibrated for me and a different narrative calibrated for his brother, each one engineered to keep the other from asking a question at the wrong moment. He wasn't worried about getting caught by circumstance. He'd already built the contingency for being questioned by the one person in the family who might reasonably ask what was going on. I stood there with my coffee going properly cold in my hand and understood, all at once and with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I wasn't looking at a son who had stumbled into an opportunity and let temptation get the better of him for one weak morning. I was looking at a son who had been constructing this specific outcome for long enough that he had answers ready for contingencies that hadn't even happened yet. The test I'd built to find out whether he'd say something true in an unguarded moment had worked exactly as intended. What I hadn't planned for was discovering that the unguarded moment was only the surface of something considerably deeper and more deliberate underneath it. I heard him wrap up the call a few moments later, some closing pleasantry to whoever was on the other end, and then the sound of his footsteps coming back along the path toward the side door. I moved then, quickly and quietly, back toward the stove, so that by the time the door opened, I was standing where a man makes breakfast, rather than where a man has just stood frozen for several minutes, processing the worst thing he's heard about his own child in longer than he can remember. He came in with the particular warmth of a man who has just had an excellent phone call and is feeling good about the direction of his week, which told me something too, that whoever was on the other end had apparently confirmed something to his satisfaction. "Good morning," he said, and I said good morning back and poured him coffee and set it in front of him at the table the way I always do, and sat down across from him with a plate of eggs I don't remember actually tasting. I told him I'd been thinking about what I'd said the night before. He looked at me with the specific attentiveness of a man listening for particular information hidden inside a general sentence, and I understood that he was trying to gauge whether the timeline he'd just laid out on the phone was still intact. I said I thought I needed a few weeks before making any decisions. I said I wanted to think it through properly, maybe talk to someone about the estate side of things before I did anything permanent with the house. I watched something shift behind his eyes, a small and almost imperceptible recalculation, a man adjusting a timeline that had just gotten a little longer than he'd built into his plan. "Of course," he said. "Absolutely. Take all the time you need." He said it warmly, generously even, the way a person says it when they've decided that patience now is a small price for whatever they expect to gain later. He left not long after breakfast, hugged me at the door the way he always does, told me to call if I needed anything. I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street, and then I went to my desk and picked up the phone, and I did not call an estate attorney first, whatever the eventual sequence of that day might suggest. I called my younger son. He picked up on the second ring. It wasn't his scheduled day to hear from me. He calls on a rhythm he set for himself years ago, and has never once broken except for a single exception I remember clearly, and I could hear in his voice immediately that something in mine had alarmed him before I'd said more than his name. "Dad," he said, "what happened?" I told him everything in order, the way I've just told it here. The test, the word, finally, the 4 minutes of backpedaling at the table, the guest room, the window, the numbers, and then the part about handling him specifically, the part I'd been carrying alone since 6 that morning, and hadn't said out loud to another living person until that moment. He He was quiet for a long time after I finished, long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. It hadn't. He was simply absorbing something about a person he had trusted for his entire life, turning it over the way you turn over something you're not ready to believe but can't find a reason to doubt. He said he wanted to ask me one question before anything else. How much had the business actually sold for? Not the fictional number I'd built for the test, the real one, I told him. The line went quiet again, and this time I heard him exhale slowly, the specific sound of a man doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at a figure considerably larger than whatever he'd previously understood to be true. He said he was going to tell me something, and he wasn't sure how it would land given everything I'd just told him, but he wanted me to have it anyway. 6 months earlier, he said, his brother had called him. Just checking in, he'd said at the time, the way he always frames these calls. Nothing that struck my younger son as unusual in the moment. During that call, his brother had told him that the business sale had barely covered outstanding debts, that I was in a worse financial position than I let on, that I was quietly worried about the house and hadn't wanted to burden either of them with it directly. He'd asked my younger son to keep an eye on me without making it obvious that he was doing so, to mention it to him first if anything seemed off, rather than raising alarm with me directly, since I apparently didn't like feeling like a burden. My younger son had believed every word of it. Of course he had. There was no reason not to. His brother had never given him a specific reason to doubt information delivered in that particular tone. Warm, concerned, protective. He told me now that he'd spent the last 6 months quietly worried about my finances in the background of his own life, wondering whether he should offer to help without making me feel diminished by the offer, all based on a story that had apparently been constructed for him with the same care as the one being constructed for me. I sat with that for a moment. Two separate narratives, built and maintained simultaneously, each one calibrated to produce the same eventual outcome without either of us ever comparing notes long enough to notice the seams between them. A father who believed he had nothing worth protecting, and a brother who believed the same, managed carefully enough that neither of us would think to question the number that eventually arrived, because we'd both already been told, in advance, exactly what to expect. "What do you need from me?" my younger son asked, once he'd finished telling me his half of it. Not what do we do, not what should we do about him, just the direct and practical question of a man who wanted to be useful rather than emotional in a moment that called for both. "I need this kept between us for now," I told him, "and I need the name of a good estate attorney if you happen to have one." He had one. Of course he did. He's the kind of man who files away useful names before he knows he'll need them, not out of calculation, but out of the habit of paying close attention to the world around him. The attorney was a woman with an office in the city, someone my younger son described as precise, unhurried, and entirely unbothered by family drama. Exactly the temperament I needed rather than someone who would treat this as a crisis requiring urgency over accuracy. I called her that same morning. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me one question first. Did I have documentation of the actual business sale, the real numbers, not the version I'd constructed for the test? I told her I had the complete closing documentation and an accountant who had managed my books carefully for years. "Good," she said, and the conversation I'd overheard through the window, had I recorded it. I hadn't thought to. She was quiet for a moment, the pause of a professional weighing how much a piece of missing evidence actually mattered. She told me the word "finally," combined with the substance of the call and the documented financial reality underneath it, gave a clear enough picture even without a recording. What mattered most was building an accurate asset picture in writing, signed and notarized, in a way that left no room for a different version of events to take root later. She wanted to see me the next morning. I was there 15 minutes before the office opened. In person, she was exactly what her phone manner had suggested, calm in the way of someone who has seen a version of this situation often enough to know precisely where each step leads without needing to rush toward it. She took notes in a small, careful hand while I told her everything again in order, and by the time I finished, she had a list of what she needed from me. The business sale documentation, the complete current asset picture from my accountant, my existing estate documents, a written and dated account of both the Sunday dinner and the Monday morning phone call, made as close to verbatim as memory allowed. I asked how much weight an account like that carried without a recording behind it. Combined with everything else, she said, significant weight. She reminded me I wasn't filing a criminal complaint, at least not at this stage. I was establishing an accurate documented record of my actual financial position and revising my estate to reflect it, and the account of the phone call was supporting context for that record rather than the foundation underneath it. The foundation was the numbers. The numbers, once assembled, were substantial. The business sale, considerably more than the fictional figure I'd built for the test. The house itself, independently appraised that same week at a figure close to what my son had estimated on the phone, which told me his read on the market had been accurate even if his intentions around it hadn't been. Retirement accounts and additional savings accumulated carefully over decades of disciplined management. A total picture worth several $1,000,000, held by a man his own son believed was on the verge of losing his home. The attorney spent the following days revising my estate documents, and I want to be specific about what changed and what didn't, because I think both halves of that matter to understanding what I was actually trying to do, which was never punishment for its own sake. My younger son's position didn't change. I want to state that plainly. He had been in my will honestly and appropriately for years, and nothing I'd learned in the preceding days altered the accurate accounting of a relationship that had always been exactly what it appeared to be. If anything, everything I'd learned only reinforced how straightforward and uncomplicated that relationship had always been. What changed was his brother's position, though not to nothing, and accuracy matters here more than the distinction might first suggest. The revision wasn't designed as punishment. It was designed to be accurate, which meant reflecting the relationship as it had actually turned out to be, rather than the relationship he'd spent considerable effort cultivating in my direction. His share was restructured to a specific documented sum, one that accounted honestly for support and loans across his adult life that had never been repaid or even acknowledged as loans in the first place, and which left him something without leaving him the position he'd been carefully building himself toward. The house itself was placed into a trust, with the attorney serving as an independent trustee rather than any family member. It could not be sold without her written approval and a fresh independent appraisal within 60 days of any offer being presented, and no family member, under any circumstance, could serve as either the buyer or the buyer's agent on any transaction involving the property. The terms were specific enough and airtight enough that the exact plan I'd overheard on the flagstone path became structurally impossible, regardless of how it might be dressed up or repackaged by anyone in the future. My younger son was named co-trustee alongside her, not as a reward and not as a way of choosing a side in some dramatic family rift, but because it made practical sense to have someone in the family with a stake in the property's proper handling, someone whose judgment on the matter I trusted without qualification. The documents were signed, notarized, and filed on a Friday afternoon, 10 days after the Sunday dinner where I'd told my son I was broke and he'd said one word before he could stop himself. I remember sitting in the attorney's office after everything was signed, feeling a strange kind of stillness that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, more like the specific quiet that follows finishing a piece of necessary work that you wished from the beginning you'd never had reason to do. I called him on a Saturday and asked him to come by that afternoon. He agreed immediately, the way he always agrees, and I spent the hours before he arrived thinking carefully about how I wanted to say what I needed to say, because I understood this conversation mattered more than almost any I'd had with him as an adult, and I didn't want to waste the weight of it by handling the delivery poorly. He arrived at exactly the time I'd suggested, which is typical of him when he believes something significant might be happening. He was wearing the same practiced warmth he'd carried since Sunday, the warmth of a man managing a situation he believes is still moving in his intended direction. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where all of this had started 10 days earlier, and I sat down across from him. I told him I wanted to say something true before anything else, so that everything that followed would be understood inside that truth rather than separate from it. I told him I loved him. I told him that was true regardless of whatever else I was about to say, and that I needed him to hold both things at once rather than letting the second thing erase the first. Something shifted in his face. A small, involuntary movement, the early recognition of a man realizing the conversation he'd walked into wasn't the one he'd prepared for. I told him I hadn't been broke, that the business sale had gone well, that the savings were intact, that the house wasn't being sold under any circumstances that would involve him in the way he'd apparently planned. I told him I'd constructed the entire scenario as a test, because I'd noticed things over the preceding months that troubled me enough to need an answer rather than continue guessing. Silence on his end that stretched longer than I expected. I let it stretch. I'd learned enough in the last 10 days to understand that the silence itself often carries more information than whatever fills it eventually. And the next morning, I told him, when you were outside on the flagstone path thinking the window was shut, it wasn't. I've lived in this house 30 years. I know exactly how sound moves along that wall. His face went the specific pale of a man rapidly reconstructing an entire recent stretch of his life and discovering in real time that the reconstruction was not landing anywhere in his favor. He didn't try to deny it. I want to give him that clearly and without qualification, because it told me something in the moment that I hadn't been sure of before it happened. He sat at the table with his hands flat against the wood and didn't attempt to construct an alternate version of events in which what I'd just described hadn't actually happened, which is not nothing. Coming from a man who had clearly demonstrated, over the preceding week and a half, a considerable capacity for constructing alternate versions of events when it suited him. The house is worth $900, he said finally, quietly, not as a denial, but as though confirming a number out loud settled something in him. I have an independent appraisal from this week, I told him. You were going to offer $750 as a friendly deal from a family contact. I know the exact figure because you said it yourself, out loud, standing on my own flagstone path. He closed his eyes for a moment. Did you tell my brother about the phone call? He asked. I told your brother about all of it, I said, including the part where you said you'd already built a plan for handling him specifically. He opened his eyes and looked at the table for a long moment rather than at me. The estate documents have already been revised and filed, I told him. The house is in a trust now, with an independent trustee and terms that make what you were building structurally impossible. Your brother is named as co-trustee. He nodded slowly, as though absorbing each piece separately, rather than all at once. Are you in trouble? I asked him, not angrily. I want to be clear that by this point in the conversation, whatever anger I'd carried through the preceding 10 days had settled into something closer to a plain need to understand understand what I was actually dealing with, because a man who builds an elaborate plan to extract equity from his own father's house is either simply opportunistic, or he's drowning in something specific enough that the house had started to look to him like the only visible way out. A long pause followed, the kind that has genuine weight behind it rather than simple hesitation. "Yes," he said eventually. "Tell me," I said, and he did, though not all at once, and not cleanly. The way truth comes out of a person after it's been compressed under pressure for a long stretch of time, in pieces, with stops and restarts, several places where he lost the thread of his own account and had to find it again before continuing. A development deal, he said, that had gone badly wrong roughly 2 years earlier, the kind that collapses when financing assumptions shift faster than a project can adjust. He'd entered a second deal to cover the losses from the first, a dangerous pattern in that industry, and that second deal hadn't resolved either. Personal guarantees sat behind both arrangements, so the exposure wasn't contained to his business at all. It had followed him directly into his own finances. He wasn't broke, he told me, but he was close enough to understand exactly what broke felt like from the inside, and the distance between where he actually stood and where he needed to be had made my house look to him like the only bridge wide enough to cross that particular gap. I listened to the entire account without interrupting. When he finished, I sat with it for a moment before responding. "You should have called me," I told him, "not to take something from me, to ask. There's a version of the last 8 months where you call me and say, 'I'm in trouble and I need help,' and we have a completely different 8 months than the one we actually had. I don't know if I would have helped," I told him honestly. "I want to be honest about that rather than softening it for his benefit. What you were actually planning, the house, the specific position you'd built around it, told me something about your judgment that I'm still sitting with even now. But I would have listened. I would have had the conversation." He put his hand over his eyes and sat like that for a while, and when he lowered it again, he looked, for the first time in this entire conversation, less like a man managing a situation, and more like a man who had simply run out of any managed version left to offer. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry." And something in how he said it, quieter than anything else he'd said that afternoon, without the practiced warmth underneath it, made me believe, at least in that moment, that it was real. We talked a while longer about practical things, an attorney of his own, a direct conversation with his brother rather than one through me, a plan for actually addressing the underlying debt instead of looking for another bridge around it. He left a little after 5, and I stood at the window and watched his car pull away, feeling something closer to relief than anything I'd felt in the preceding 10 days. I called his brother that evening and told him how the conversation had gone. He was quiet for a moment, then asked how his brother had looked when he left. Like someone who'd put something very heavy down, I told him, and wasn't sure yet what to do with his hands now that they were empty. His brother made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a short laugh. "That sounds like him," he said. For a while after that, things were quiet in the way that follows a genuine crisis once the immediate danger has passed. He called more regularly than before. He mentioned once that he'd started meeting with his own attorney about the development deals. It felt, for a stretch of several weeks, like something had actually been resolved rather than merely paused. The quiet lasted about 6 weeks. I want to note that specifically because 6 weeks is long enough that a person starts to relax into a new normal without quite noticing they've done it, which is precisely the condition under which the next piece of this arrived and caught me somewhat unprepared for it, even though in hindsight I should have expected that a story built on 2 simultaneous fictions might have more than 2 layers underneath it. It came from the same accountant who had helped me build the fictional numbers for the original test, a careful man who had also, over the years, done occasional work reviewing certain family financial matters when I asked him to, informally, as a favor rather than a formal engagement. He called me on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and I could tell from the particular hesitation in his voice before he said anything substantive that whatever had prompted the call wasn't something he was looking forward to relaying. He told me he'd been doing some routine work related to the trust documentation, cross-referencing certain figures as part of properly establishing the accurate asset picture the attorney had requested, and in the process, he'd come across something that didn't quite square with what my son had described to me at that kitchen table 6 weeks earlier. The development deal was real. He confirmed that much immediately, not wanting me to think the entire confession had been fabricated, because it hadn't been. But the losses attached to it were smaller than what my son had described to me, smaller by a meaningful margin, enough that the picture of a man drowning under an unmanageable weight didn't fully hold up against the actual documentation once someone with the right access looked closely at it. What the accountant had found instead was a separate obligation entirely, one that predated the development deal by roughly a year, tied to a business relationship my son had never mentioned to me at all, in that conversation or in any other. A private loan, structured informally between individuals rather than through any institution, carrying terms that had escalated considerably once early payments had been missed. The kind of arrangement people enter when they believe they can resolve something quickly and quietly, and then discover, once it's too late to walk it back cleanly, that the terms were never actually designed to be resolved quickly or quietly at all. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after the accountant finished explaining what he'd found. The confession at my kitchen table, the one that had felt, in the moment, like the bottom of whatever this was, hadn't been dishonest exactly. It had simply been incomplete in a way that was itself a kind of dishonesty. reality. A true story told carefully enough to leave out the part that would have changed how I understood everything else. I asked the accountant who the private loan was actually with. He hesitated again, longer this time, and told me he'd rather I heard the specifics from my son directly, but that the documentation was clear enough I should ask soon, before the terms escalated further. I called my son that same evening. I didn't announce what I'd learned right away. I asked him instead, plainly, whether the development deal was the complete picture of what he'd been dealing with, or whether there was something else underneath it he hadn't mentioned at the table 6 weeks earlier. The silence on his end told me everything before he said a word. He told me eventually, once it was clear that whatever careful account he'd built wasn't going to survive contact with what I already knew. The private loan had come from a business associate he'd described to me in the past, only ever as a friend. The loan had covered a personal obligation that had nothing to do with the development deal at all, something he still wouldn't fully specify, and the terms had escalated far past whatever he'd originally agreed to, the way a debt does when it's allowed to sit unaddressed between people who both know exactly how much leverage has quietly accumulated. This was the part he hadn't told me at the kitchen table, not because he'd forgotten it, and not because it was somehow less relevant than the development deal he had disclosed. He'd left it out because it was the part that would have made the entire plan around the house look less like a man in over his head reaching for the nearest available bridge, and more like a man who understood precisely what he owed to precisely whom, and had built an elaborate structure specifically to generate the exact sum required to make a dangerous problem disappear before anyone else in the family ever had to know it existed. I asked him directly whether the confession at my kitchen table had been honest. He was quiet a long moment before answering. It was true, he said, just not all of it. I told myself I'd tell you the rest once the house situation resolved, once I actually had a way to fix it properly instead of just describing how bad it already was. I sat with that answer longer than almost anything else in this entire situation, because it told me something the first reveal hadn't. The first reveal had shown me a son capable of building a plan around his father's trust. This one showed me a son capable of watching that same father absorb a partial truth as though it were the complete one, accepting a confession as closure, and saying nothing to correct that impression for 6 additional weeks, while a considerably more serious problem continued escalating quietly in the background. I called his brother again that same night, later than I usually would, because I understood he needed to hear this before too much more time passed, given how much of the last 2 months had already been shaped by information arriving to him a step behind everyone else. He listened without interrupting, the way he does, and when I finished, he was quiet for a while before saying anything. He asked me one question, quieter than I expected. Do you think he was ever actually going to tell either of us the rest of it? I told him honestly that I didn't know. I told him I'd wanted to believe the kitchen table conversation 6 weeks earlier, wanted to believe that whatever I'd heard in his voice that afternoon, the specific unpracticed quality of it, the absence of the warmth he usually performs, had meant something real rather than simply meaning he was skilled enough to make an incomplete truth sound exactly like a complete one. I still don't fully know how to hold both halves of this at once. The son who said finally before he could stop himself and then built a careful architecture around extracting equity from a house I'd lived in for 30 years, believing I would never know the difference. And the same son who sat at my kitchen table afterward and offered me something that felt like genuine remorse, and may well have been genuine as far as it went, while withholding the one piece of information that would have told me how much further underneath the surface the actual problem ran. I don't have a clean way to close the distance between those two versions of him. I'm not sure a clean way exists. What I know is that the debt is real, considerably more dangerous than what he first described to me, and still, as of this writing, not something he's fully resolved or fully explained, even now, even after being caught a second time in the specific act of leaving something important unsaid. I think about the word finally more than I expected to, this many weeks out from the evening he first said it. Not because it was the worst thing he said in the entire span of this, it wasn't, not by any measure, but because it was the moment everything else became possible to see clearly, the first small crack that let enough light through to eventually reveal how much else had been sitting in the dark underneath it, waiting for someone to look closely enough for long enough to finally notice.